Keith L. Henley is the veteran being interviewed today. He was born on October 7th, 1931. He lives at 992 West Ryan Road in Columbia City, Indiana. Keith was born in Dublin, Indiana, and he served in the Air Force. Keith, tell me about your enlistment in the Air Force.
Well, going back just a little beyond that, or before that, I graduated from high school in May of '49, and quite a few of the classmates were joining some branch of the service even at that date. I went to work in Richmond, Indiana at a Crosley-Afco company where I had worked the previous summer part-time. And I worked there until it was probably mid-year in 1950. And then on the 26th of June, when the Korean War started, everyone that weren't going to college or married at that time was starting to get the feel that maybe we should enlist or wait and be drafted or whatever. At that point, I checked around. I talked to the Guard and National Guard at that time, and talked to the Marine recruiter who had enlisted several of my classmates the year before. And he was a good friend of my dad's at the time. And my best friend, who was in Korea, had went through some pretty hectic battles over there with the Chinese at that time, had written me and said that if it was his suggestion to me, I should consider the Air Force. So I ended up talking to the Air Force recruiter in the fall of 1950, and as a result, I signed up in December 1950. The Air Force at that time was overloaded with incoming recruits, and they had a waiting list. So I went on a waiting list among 7 other classmates. There was 8 of us that was going to join the Air Force. And in early January, we still hadn't heard anything, and then overnight we got a call that said we would be leaving for Indianapolis on the 9th of January, early in the morning. So we loaded a bus early, about 5:30 in the morning on the 9th of January in Richmond, Indiana, and proceeded to Indianapolis, where we processed, and late afternoon we were sworn into the Air Force. We then loaded on the buses and headed for Lackland Air Force Base, San Antonio, Texas. At that time, there were so many going, evidently they weren't flying them anymore. So it took us 2 days and 2 complete days, and we arrived at Lackland, I think, on the morning of it was either late on the 10th or early morning on the 11th. And our first shock was there was no barracks available. And we became part of what they called Tent City at that time. And it was that way because there was more recruits coming in than they had facilities available for housing and getting clothes or anything else. At that time, a lot of the new recruits was being diverted to Sampson Air Force Base in New York. But since we were at Lackland, they weren't going to move us there to finish basics. So in about 4 weeks, and I think it was closer to 5, we got word that due to the facilities being not available, and they had to move us out somewhere, each one of us got orders to go to another location. My assignment was to Vance Air Force Base, which was a pilot training wing in Enid, Oklahoma. So we went up there, and I say we, there were several in my group, none of which I enlisted with. All 8 of us were split up. But when I got to Vance, it became very apparent that there would be no more schooling until I finished basic training, which lasted, I think, less than a month. And at that point, I was assigned to the orderly room in this, it was a medical squadron, and it was part of the 35th, 75th, if I remember right, pilot training wing. And I became the morning report clerk, which was a daily document that recorded where everyone in the squadron was at, whether he was on leave or AWOL or they were on duty or they were in sick call or whatever. And I seemed to adapt to it real quickly. And as a result, they decided to keep me permanently in the orderly room. And I went to a sort of an OJT personnel school. I went to a typing school and had never typed in my life. You can imagine me doing the morning report clerk. It was sort of joyous. But anyway, I also become the mail clerk, which, as I look back, I was the most popular person in the unit. But I got to know everybody, and during the summer of '51, I was fortunate at Vance to be close to some distant family members, cousins primarily, who lived about 40 miles north of Enid, Oklahoma. So I guess it was a good fortune that I got assigned there, because I've become very close to these cousins, and my folks came out and visited me. So in essence, they had occasion to have a good family reunion with old cousins. Most of the cousins were 75, 80 years old, who are all gone now, of course. But anyway, in the fall of '51, I was called down to wing headquarters and informed that I would be getting orders within a few days, sending me to Korea. And which wasn't news I wanted to hear, but anyway, I called home and told my folks that I would be home within a couple weeks, and then according to my instructions, I'd be going to California and overseas. Well, I had planned accordingly on this information, and then I got called back to wing headquarters about a week later, and at that point they said your assignment to Korea had been canceled. And I asked them for what reason, and they said, well, someone had volunteered in your career AFSC, and we would rather take a volunteer since you didn't volunteer. And I said, well, where am I going now? And they said, well, you're going to be subsequently assigned to Germany. So, as it turned out, I called home and said I wouldn't be going to the Korean Peninsula, and I'd be going to Germany for assignment, which at that point was still overseas. And for a 19-year-old person who had never been out of Dublin, Indiana, which was a town of 600 people, it was still sort of overwhelming to visualize going overseas. But anyway, I reported to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey in late November of '51, where I stayed for about 10 days in processing and waiting orders to go overseas, which came in early December. And on the 7th of December, which was a ironic date, I guess, to be going anywhere based on 1941, I boarded the General USS Callan, which was a World War II troop ship, and headed for Bremerhaven, Germany, by way of St. John's, Newfoundland. And we left Brooklyn Navy Yards on the 7th of December and went to Newfoundland and let off quite a few Air Force people. A few Army people was on the ship. And then we headed across the North Atlantic, and we landed in Bremerhaven on the, it seems like the 13th or 14th of December. And we were there for a short time, and then we got on a train and went to southern Germany, a little town called Sonthofen. It was down in the Bavarian Alps, and it was an Army processing center. And I was there for 4 or 5 days. And then I received orders to proceed to Ryan, Maine Air Force Base for further assignment. So I arrived in Ryan, Maine on the 23rd of December, 1951, knowing nobody. It was sort of funny how quickly you do make new friends. But anyway, on Christmas Eve, a group of, everyone was in the same boat, and they were all Air Force people, and there was one other person that was being assigned to Ryan, Maine, which I didn't know at the time. So we went out Christmas Eve and sort of went to the Airmen's Club and ended up coming back home late, and but we got acquainted with a lot of other people, and we had Christmas dinner in '51 at the mess hall. And then shortly after Christmas was over, we received assignment. I was assigned to a unit called the 7,000th Base Complement Squadron, which was a personnel processing squadron located in a little German village called Buschlag. It was about an 8-mile bus trip outside of Frankfurt am Main, and we processed Air Force personnel coming in just like I had came in for subsequent assignment throughout the European theater. Really an interesting assignment. We worked in an old German house, nice facilities, and it was, looking back, quite a unique assignment compared to what it could have been. And I met a lot of people, you know, they came in for service. I was a corporal at that time, and then I ended up making buck sergeant there, and that was when they still called you sergeant for 3 stripes, and shortly after that the Air Force changed it to Airman First Class, which we hated because, you know, when you was a sergeant, you were sort of, you felt like you were somebody pretty special. But anyway, while there, I was billeted on Ryan, Maine Air Base, and during that spring of '52, that would have been, I had occasion to meet a lot of pilots who were assigned to this same group. Most of them flew with the 12th Troop Carrier Wing, which was an active flying unit on Ryan, Maine at the time. And I ended up having opportunities to go on numerous trips with an invite from some of these pilots that I had occasion to meet. And my first trip, luckily, was in March of '52. I was invited by Captain Becker, John Becker, who was a senior pilot at the time and a captain. Wondered if myself and several of my friends would be interested in going to Rome for a weekend. Actually, Rome, you know, you think, my goodness, what an opportunity. So we did. That was my first of many, many trips. We flew to Rome and spent a glorious weekend. And when we left Rome to come back on Sunday, we was going to fly over the Pyrenees, which was in southern France, due to some bad weather in northern Italy. Well, we got out about 40 miles and one of our engines quit. And the captain sent the co-pilot back and said, guys, you better get your parachutes on because we've got a serious situation. And we're going to see if we can, you know, return to Rome with one engine. It was a C-47, which was a very popular, very efficient plane at that time. So we all stood up, and the instructions given us, if the red light goes on, get out of here, quick. Well, none of us had an inkling of having had to jump out of a plane before. But anyway, to make a long story short, the captain returned safely to Rome, and to our delight, we had 2 more days of very, very much enjoyment, seeing, you know, all the things that Rome offered. And the engine was fixed, and I think we got back on a Tuesday, and this wasn't held against us because it was, you know, beyond our controlled. But anyway, that was the first of many trips there. But in May, I think it was in May of '52, all of a sudden our squadron was going to be deactivated. Why, who knows? But over the course of the next few weeks, we were processing people out, and I was one of the last ones to go, and I ended up going to headquarters USAFE in Wiesbaden, Germany. TDY, with a subsequent assignment in the fall to headquarters U.S. European Command in Frankfurt, Germany. So I went to Wiesbaden, and it was processing work, personnel work. It's the same thing. But when I ended up in Frankfurt, Germany, I was assigned to the IG Farben building, which is a famous, today it's still one of the most beautiful structures in Frankfurt. It was spared by the bombing in World War II because it was a former SS German headquarters that the United States had determined to not destroy, with the understanding once the war was over, if it was still there, would be a great place to set up a major headquarters. So anyway, this was my end assignment in late '52, and it was an assignment directly under NATO headquarters, Supreme Headquarters. And shortly after I was assigned there, one of the highlights, I think, in my Air Force career, many, General Eisenhower, who was then Supreme Commander in shape in The Hague, had decided to return to the United States, retire, and run for president in '52. Well, it so happened our headquarters, since we were heavy with general officers and full colonels, and mostly, there was a few international officers there. We had an Army General Handy who was the chief or senior officer at that time. But anyway, General Eisenhower came through there for his going away ceremony, which I have pictures that I took myself real close to Ike, we called him. And of course that was a pretty special time at that time. Of course, as everyone knows, he returned to the United States and ran for president, served 8 years. But another notable at that time was Matthew Ridgway, who was a Army general who had served during World War II in Germany. And he had replaced General Eisenhower. And ironically, he was only in the assignment a month, and he got reassigned and came through for a big parade, which I also got a lot of pictures of. So it seemed like we was constantly in parades at that time. But while there, I was the person in charge of all finances, TDY finances, payroll for all the officers in the outfit, which fortunately for me, I got along good in the job. And I knew everyone from 3-star generals to not very many lower than colonel, but I was the most important person, as a lot of them always told me, in the outfit. As a result, I got invited on many, many trips. We went just almost everywhere you can imagine, Athens, and of course Italy, France, England, North Africa. We went to Casablanca on a trip. Norway, Sweden, Denmark 4 or 5 times, Amsterdam, The Hague, Ireland, Scotland. Mostly on weekends, but most of them were invite trips. So I guess you might say I was very fortunate to do this, but looking back, what a great opportunity. The only opportunity I ever missed, there was a Colonel Joe Keeler, who I got to know real well. And he come in one day and he says, how'd you like to go to the Belgian Congo? He said, we have a mission down there, and I have to fly down there. And I think I'm going to just stay 10 days and go on a safari. And he says, if you'd like to go, I'll get you on the trip. Because, you know, if they asked for you, you went. And I thought about it, and I thought, well, I just making $175 a month. I didn't feel like I could afford it. But to make a long story short, when he returned, he told me that how great the trip was, and they had went on a safari and showed me pictures. And for $300 or $400, as he said, all that it would cost me, my housing would have been free, the trip was free. And it was one regret that I had, that I never went on that trip. But looking back, probably it would have been a trip of a lifetime. It was official business. It wasn't, you know, something off the illegal type thing. But as far as trips, you know, it was a great assignment. And in late, this took us into the spring of '53 probably. General Henley, who was the commanding general of Headquarters U.S. European Command, was quite a baseball, softball fan. So I knew they had had a team in '52, which I didn't get there in time to participate, but I was quite a good little ball player. I'd played in high school and had lettered, and the only negative in my situation was I wasn't very big, but I was fast. I could bat with either left-handed or right-handed, and I was a good fielder, outfielder, and really the fastest person on any team I ever played on. Well, anyway, they had tryouts in the spring of '53, and I made one of the 13 members on the team, and was picked as a starting outfielder and leadoff batter. To make a long story short, for the season, we were excused from duties for the duration of the ball season. My commander at that time wasn't very happy about it. In fact, we traveled to London several times, went into Italy and played Navy teams, and went to Bremerhaven for Army teams. It was 3 months, and on one of the trips to London, I think it was, this captain that I worked for said, "You're not going?" I said, "Yes, sir. You know, if that's what you want to do." Well, anyway, the word got back to General Henley that they wouldn't let me go. Well, anyway, it happened pretty quick. The captain called me in and threw some orders at me and said, "You SOB, get out of here." Anyway, that was the only problem I ever had. But we won 55 games that year and lost 1, and we won the European Championship, which involved Army, Navy teams throughout the whole European theater. So it was a great spring and early summer of '53. And then, of course, I did do, you know, my job when I wasn't, you know, out of the area. I still worked, but had a lot of friends. To this day, I haven't attempted to research some of the players that were on the team. At the time, there was one that was apparently in the minor league section system of Detroit. There was another one that was in the Philadelphia system, and we had a pitcher that, well, his name was Young, who he was a left-hander and lost 1 game in 56 outings. So that tells you how good he was, but as far as I know, he never proceeded into the majors or anything. But in late '53, and back stepping a little bit, when I was still in Bushlow, Germany, there was a sergeant came through en route to Oslo, Norway, and he was a Norwegian from Minnesota, and he was being assigned up there as a member of the commanding general in Norway on his flight crew. And he had a brother stationed there. And we become very close friends in the week or so that he was there. And he said, if you ever get a chance to come to Norway, let me know. And I'll meet you and show you around. Which I did on one of my many trips. I called him and I went up on a weekend and he showed me around Oslo and I fell in love with it. Well, in late fall of '53, I got a letter from him. He said, got something I want you to follow up on. We're transferring personnel in your AFSC, and he's leaving on this date, and we're going to be looking for somebody. And he says, if you can pull any strings, if you happen to know anybody in the right places, maybe you can get assigned up here. Well, I went to my commander, and he said, I won't release you, just forget it. But at that time, I was going on TD Wiesbaden regularly, and I'd got to know a Captain Carlos Presti in personnel, headquarters USAFE. And he was from Indianapolis. So we were buddies, I guess to a point. Well, I went up there on some other business, and I went in and saw him. And I said, Captain Presti, I understand there's going to be a vacancy in Headquarters Allied Air Forces, Northern Europe in Oslo. And he says, how in the heck do you know that? I said, well, I've just got a feeling that there's going to be. He looked at me and laughed. He says, let me check on that. And whatever he did, and he said, you got better information than I got. And he said, yeah, there is going to be a personnel slot up there in December or January '54. So I said, okay, what do I need to do? He said, well, first of all, you got to get released by your commander in Frankfurt. And I said, I don't think he will. He said, well, indirectly, you can still submit an application. It comes to me. He said, we approve it right here, but I won't guarantee you anything. So anyway, I went back and I talked to Captain Tibbetts at the time. And he said, you really want to apply for this? And I said, well, as you know, there's no guarantee I'm going to get it. But he said, if you want to put in for it, submit it according to 3510, which I think was the regulation on reassignment. And I will recommend you very highly. I don't want to lose you, but I will. He said, in between you and me, I'm leaving in 90 days also to go back to the States. And I think that had some bearing. But anyway, he submitted it through, it was a full colonel at that time. And he knew me too, and he recommended me highly. It went to headquarters USAFE. I didn't hear anything. That was in probably September. Didn't hear anything in October or November. In early December, I got notice that I had been selected to go to Oslo, Norway in January '54. Anyway, before I went, I was called on a court-martial down in Ramstein. I don't remember the exact particulars, but I went to Ramstein in December, or early January, and they had to delay my reassignment for a week or so. And I went down there and I waited 2 or 3 days, and they settled the court-martial. It was a general court-martial, and to this day I can't remember the particulars of it, but apparently it had something to do with some fraud or something that I had somehow processed some papers. I wasn't at fault or anything, but they settled it without a trial. So I went back to Frankfurt, got my stuff together, and got on an airplane, and ended up going to Oslo, Norway, where I was assigned to Headquarters Allied Air Forces Northern Europe, and it was a joint headquarters of Norwegian, Danish, and British personnel, and we were a very small handful of American personnel, but it was an assignment that was not only a dream assignment, but very interesting because you work with other nationalities and we worked close with the American Embassy and the MAG at that time. They had the MAG unit there, and here they had a big air attaché unit, which was very high intelligence units at that time. But we were a very close unit. We worked in civilian clothes, had a civilian clothing allowance, and we had diplomatic privileges for a vehicle if you had one, which I ended up getting one. And so the friend that had helped me get there, without his help, I probably wouldn't have got there. But to this day, we communicate with each other by telephone. He's in California. And so looking back, that was a highlight, you might say, of my Air Force assignments in Europe. From there, I extended a year, and I ended up staying 5 years on my first hitch, because I didn't get there until January 54, and I would have rotated and been discharged in December 54. So I ended up extending a year, and I returned in December 55, went to Paris for processing, and returned to United States and processed out of the Air Force on the 14th of December 55, which was the end of my just under 5 years service. I returned to Dublin, Indiana, where I stayed. I went back to work at the same location I had retired or had originally worked at. But it wasn't for some reason what I was satisfied with. Being in a small town, the activity, there was none. I started dating an old high school sweetheart that I knew her all through high school, and of course she wanted to get married, and at that point I wasn't really in that mode yet. And but we dated pretty heavy, and after just under 3 months, I got the urge to go back in the Air Force. So I thought I'd try to work a deal and get assigned to this unit, 1020 Special Activities Wing at Fort Myers, South Coast, Virginia, because they controlled all assignments to places like I had been in Norway. So in the back of my mind, I thought, well, hey, I've had pretty good luck manipulating a good assignment, so I'm going to go back there. So I called them, and they said, yeah, they had an opening for me. So I went to Cincinnati instead of Indianapolis, due to the region had something to do with it. And I re-enlisted for 4 more years and was assigned to the Fort Myers South Post. Well, I ended up working in the Pentagon most of the time, which was interesting. Looking back, it was a great experience. Of course, general officers there were a dime a dozen, you know. A major general, it was nothing, you know. You had admirals and you had Marine generals. But anyway, it was a good assignment to a point, but I didn't like Washington. Washington, D.C. at that time was, and still is, had a pretty heavy crime area. They didn't seem to bother us at that time as far as military. But one of my best friends worked there, so we had a chance to sort of reconcile a little bit after a number of years from high school times. But the old Washington Senators were stationed there in baseball. Being a great baseball fan, I went to a lot of games there, and in those days, if you wore a uniform, you got in free. So me and a couple of my friends, we went to games when they played at home about all the time. But anyway, I had went over 5 years service at that time, primarily because I had served almost 5 on my first hitch. And through some, I don't know even how it came up, I looked into recruiting duty, and I found that one of the prerequisites was staff sergeant and have over 5 years service, and preferably returned from overseas recently, and you were eligible to apply. So I did apply, and in, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4 weeks, I received orders from Headquarters Recruiting Service. It said that I had been selected for assignment to Fort Wayne, Indiana, with 11 weeks of recruiting school en route, and the assignment was subject to completing the course. So I left D.C. and drove back to Indiana, spent a few days, and then went to San Antonio, where I spent 11 very busy weeks going through an intensive recruiting course. And upon completion, I returned to D.C. and processed and reported into Fort Wayne, Indiana in early September 1956. Ironically, the recruiting office was across the street from a insurance company, Midwestern United Life, which is no longer there, and a little coffee shop next door, and all the girls that worked at the insurance company sort of drunk coffee and ate next door where the recruiters did. Well, one of the girls that came over there every day sort of caught my eye. And as a result, one night I called her. And she had recently had a undesirable thing happen in her life as far as the male generation or male gender was concerned. But anyway, she said, yeah, I remember you being over there. She said, I always thought you were sort of cute, except you always smoked a cigar, which I did. Anyway, we went out on a date, and this was late 57. And one thing led to another, and we become married in July of 1958. Of course, I stayed on recruiting then until 1960, and as a result, I took a discharge with 8 years, 11 months to enter civilian life. For whatever reason, I was a tech then, and I knew when I got out there would be no turning back, because at that time the Air Force would not let prior service re-enlist. They were totally ineligible, which looking back, it made no sense. You know, you'd think, and they were still looking for many first-time type enlistees, but they didn't want the qualified ones. That never did make sense. But anyway, I entered civilian life and went into, I had pursued insurance and another sales type job, which I really wasn't. Once I was out, I knew possibly I had erred in my decision. But after I was out a couple months with no benefits, I guess was the biggest scare that I faced, because I was entering a sales field with no benefits. I thought, well, let me attempt to get back in the Air Force. So I called the commander at that time. It was a major, and my record had been impeccable in recruiting. In fact, I was consistently, you know, in the upper echelon in production and everything, and awards. So he was elated. He said, well, there's no way they wouldn't take you back. So we processed paperwork. I wrote a letter explaining the circumstances and regretted the decision. It went through channels. I got endorsements from the group commander, who was a full colonel, and had all kinds of letters supporting my request. To make a long story short, the recruiting service approved me, but Department of Air Force turned it down. So at that point, there was no other place to go. And but on a whim, and I'm going to go back a little bit. I'm even going to go back to December 7th, 41. The lead pilot on a B-17 that was getting ready to land in Hawaii when the Japanese attack commenced was a major by the name of Truman H. Landon, who survived. He landed at one of the outlying airfields on one wheel. And in several movies, his name, of course it wasn't him, will be mentioned as being in that flight of B-7. Anyway, how does that affect, or come back to affect me? Well, when I was in Europe, when I went to Wiesbaden, he was commander. He was chief staff of headquarters USAF. And then he became the commander of headquarters USAF when I was in Frankfurt. Didn't know me. I did have his records at one time. And when I went to Bitburg for Ramstein for that court-martial, he was commander of 12th Air Force. He was a major general then. Well, I thought, I'm just going to go to the Pentagon. What have I got to lose? I just got in the car and went to Washington, D.C. I went to the Pentagon. I thought, well, I'm going to the DCS personnel and just see if there's some way I could be authorized to enlist. Well, just as ironic as this is going to sound, I went down to the personnel, which was a wing in the Pentagon, and here was the Deputy Chief Staff Personnel, Lieutenant General Truman H. Landon. Well, I went in, and he was gone. But I talked to a Chief Master Sergeant. And I told him my situation. I said, General Landon wouldn't remember me from Adam and Eve, but I used to process his paperwork. Of course, he always had an aide to come down. He never came down. He said, I'll tell you what, why don't you write him a letter? And he said, I'll get it here, and I'll see that he gets it. At least he'll read it. I'll guarantee he'll read it. Well, anyway, I left, drove back to Indiana, never gave it another thought. I was looking for work, and sort of not in the best of mood. We was trying to figure out what we was going to do next. And I got a call from the Pentagon. And there was this sergeant. He said, I think you're going to be happy with what I'm going to tell you. He said, General Landon is going to send a letter out. I'm going to send it today. That's going to authorize you to re-enlist in the Air Force. And I said, are you going to send something officially through channel? He said, yes, we'll send this to recruiting service right through channels. So in 2 or 3 days, I got a letter signed by him authorizing me to come back at the expense of losing tech sergeant. But anyway, I treasure that letter today, and but how that ties into going back to 7 December 41, maybe I make more out of it than I did. Had he been killed in that plane crash, who knows, or what if, you know, but maybe my good deeds in my assignment in USAFE maybe had something to do with it, or whatever. But anyway, I re-enlisted in June of 1960, spent another 4 years in Fort Wayne on recruiting, and I ended up re-enlisting again in 64 and stayed in Fort Wayne. I extended another year, and in late 65 I was in Kendallville, Indiana on recruiting. But to go back, in my early days in recruiting, I recruited in Whitley County, Indiana as an Air Force recruiter. I enlisted many area people back in the late 50s. But anyway, I was in Kendallville in Noble County, and I got a phone call from my detachment headquarters, and they said, would you be interested in going to Alaska? And I said, Alaska, I've always dreamed of going there, but what's the status? And they said, well, we just got a message from recruiting service, and they want volunteers from each group has to be a volunteer in the 73270 with a duty assignment of 99120 recruiter to go to headquarters AAC as a career motivation officer for the whole command. I said, my land. I said, when would this be? Well, it'd be within a month. I said, can I, how much time have I got? An hour. So I called Beverly, of course, and got her, fortunate. Of course, she didn't work in them days. And I said, here's what I've just been proposed. And, before you comment on anything, we'll be leaving, probably within a few months anyway, because my time on recruiting was expiring. And all indications was it would be to Vietnam, which means without you. Now this would be a guaranteed 3-year assignment with a possibility of extension a year. She said, you want to go? That's fine with me. She said, I don't want to leave home. We just bought a house. And anyway, I called back to the detachment, and they submitted my name, and I was picked out of the whole United States. As far as there was only 4 groups, so there had been only 4 people at that time. But I was picked in early December to report to Elmendorf Air Force Base in early January. And that means totally relocating, packing. Of course, we were not able to take very many items of furniture and so forth. Everything was furnished there on base housing, if you had base housing. And there was none available, which meant that we'd have to look for off-base housing. And I had since made tech again, which helped. But in late December, right after Christmas, I drove myself across country. I went to Seattle and turned my car in, and then Beverly and the 3 kids flew out, and I met them at Seattle, and then her uncle lived in Seattle, which was a godsend, who she hadn't seen in many, many, many years. And he was retired Army, worked at Boeing for many years. And they took care of her and the kids while I was processing, and took us to the commercial airport when we all got on the airplane to fly to Alaska in early January. While I was on the plane, Keith Jr. came down with chicken pox, unfortunately. And we landed in Anchorage. It was 20 below zero. Our sponsor had failed to be there because he was thinking it was the day difference. And it was pitch black. Kid was sick. And it started off very traumatic. I finally got a hold of the officer of the day at Elmendorf, and he said somebody would be there very shortly. So another NCO came out, picked us up, took us to the base, got us into quarters for the night, and everything seemed to calm down a little bit. And then in the next few days, we ended up getting an apartment off base, and got Deborah enrolled in school, and we met some people in the apartment. But anyway, my job in career motivation for Headquarters Alaskan Air Command consisted of, at that time we had 22 radar sites. And as part of my job for AAC, which had the poorest re-enlistment percentage of any command in the United States Air Force, so needless to say, the pressure was pretty heavy right away. I had an endless job with very little hope of changing it. But anyway, I would be required to hit each of these 22 sites twice a year, plus Eielson Air Force Base, plus Elmendorf Air Force Base. So I was only working 2 or 3 days, and I was on a helicopter going to a place called Fire Island, which was a radar site outside of Anchorage. And from there, I ended up going to all the radar sites, some of which were pretty nice places to go, like Kings Salmon, Alaska, where fishing's extraordinarily good, except in the wintertime. And I went to Shemya and Adak and all the outlying sites that were on mountaintops and all through the interior. So I was gone a lot of the time. And my job to go out there was to try to motivate eligible radar. Most of them were radar operators or electronic technicians. And a lot of these people had their minds made up occasionally. We didn't have totally bad fortune. There was quite a few of them that did re-enlist at that time. But my biggest job in dealing with them was also I dealt directly with headquarters USAFE as far as anyone that re-enlisted from a radar site. We had a variable re-enlistment bonus, which was only eligible to be given to certain AFSCs, as you're probably familiar with. So the job I had was a pretty high-level importance type job. And we ended up, in the 3 years that I was there, of increasing the overall re-enlistment percentage substantial. And I made master there, and trying to think from that particular point, in mid-August, moving rather quickly here, and I don't want to dwell any longer on that particular assignment. But anyway, in late August, it appeared that Vietnam was somewhere close on the horizon when I left there. And so I put in for a curtailment of my assignment for the purpose of returning to recruiting duty, because I knew recruiting was looking for me to come back, because I had been in contact with them and knew one of the guys in headquarters, USAFE, in DCS personnel at that time, and he had kept me abreast. So anyway, in August of '68, I got orders to return to headquarters recruiting service as an Air Force supervisor in Lafayette, Indiana, reporting in September '68. Quite a quick assignment. So we left there a little earlier than we had planned, and ended up going to Lafayette, Indiana. And I stayed there until late '71, and had a very enviable record. We were one of the top recruiting sectors in the whole group for several years, and had really got blessed with good people. And ended up getting ready to retire, and there was a Colonel Paul Shaninsky at the time at Group, and he called me over there one day when he got my retirement request, and said, "What in the world would it take to keep you a little longer?" I knew the Colonel real well, and I said, "Well, send me back to Fort Wayne." He looked at me, didn't say anything, and he said, "Would you stay longer if you could get back to Fort Wayne?" I said, "Yes, I have a house there, and I think it would be a great thing in order to, very easily to go from Air Force, recruiting person to a civilian job and be in my own house. Be very little transitional problem." So, okay, well, get out of here. I'll process your retirement orders. Well, maybe a month after that, I got a call from his aide. I had to report over there, and I didn't at the time give it a thought what it was about, but I thought, well, you know, our record is still good. We're leading the group for the whole year, so it can't be that. So I went in, he looked stern at me, and sit back in his chair and threw some papers there and said, here's something you might be interested in. And I looked at him, and I looked at him a little more, and I said, you kidding me? He says, yeah, you're going to Fort Wayne, but he said, you got to give me 18 more months. I said, where do I sign? So anyway, we returned to Fort Wayne, moved back in our house, and I was a recruiting supervisor for the whole northern part of the state. And stayed there till 28 February when I retired. And during the summer of '72, I went to the Indiana Real Estate Commission School and got my real estate agent's license. And in the fall of '72, I had 90 days leave coming, and I took that. So in essence, the last 3 months I was in the Air Force. I was actually transitionally working. And so when I retired one day, I just took off the uniform and put on my civilian clothes and continued working. And as a result, I ended up staying, as of '03, in September, I finished 31 years in the real estate business. And in '84, I became a broker, which meant I could open my own company, or I had a lot more things at my disposal. So as of today, since I officially retired from the other company in September this year, '03, I'm an independent broker, which I'm a member of the local board still. I still carry an active license. I can still do any business like I did before, but not on a day-to-day scale that I did for so many years. And whether I'm active or not, I still have a license and I still maintain it, and I will for a few more years. But that's a quick analogy of, or whatever the right word is, of my
That's very
most
good.
of my lifetime.
Okay, I thank you very much. That was perfect.